Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be going through my blind pick tier list for patch 14.15. And as usual, our goal for this list is to make it more of a general tier list that can apply for everyone, apply for all Illaoi brackets. There's definitely going to be some variables depending on your rank, where if you're playing in low platinum, let's say I made a list for, a low Illaoi tier list, champs like Garen or champs like Dr. Mundo would place a lot higher because of their ease of execution and the way they function in those games. But the exact same thing would apply for the reverse, where if I was making a challenger only list, champs like Cassante would place a lot higher because they're so hard to execute. And as usual, I'll be timestamping every single champion down below, so feel free to skip to your favorites. Now, as for our criteria for how I'm going to place these champions, the main one is, of course, going to be your laning power. You know, how strong your champion is as a blind pick for the early game, for your laning phase, how well you can do against your counter picks. And the second one is going to be how useful do you play out in the meta. So I'm mainly going to lean towards the laning phase, of course, over how useful you are in the meta, because the meta does kind of change a bit depending on your rank or even your server. So the main one is going to be how good is your champion as a blind pick for laning phase. First up, we have Aatrox, and I'm going to be putting Aatrox straight into A tier. It feels like that's where he belongs every single meta. That's just because this champion is a great blind pick for laning. However, I feel like he's not in the best state right now. You can't really compare him to Gore Drinker or even Duskblade Aatrox, a couple years back, but he's still pretty solid, and his matchups aren't that hard. Even the hardest ones, champs like Fiora or champs like Kennen, can be quite tricky. You get to level 4 or 5 and you're not behind, you can start to win those, especially, level 5 to 7 mark. You can run a lot of your matchups. He's quite powerful in the lane, and that's why he finds himself in A tier. The reason he's not in S is just because his counter picks can be hard, especially if they punish you, 1 to 3. Now, as for Akali, I'm going to be putting her into D tier. She's a pretty bad blind. I think she's a strong champion, especially as a counter pick, but just not the best blind pick. There's too many strong, beefy bruisers or even tanks. They can just ignore you and bash you down. Champs like Renekton are really hard, especially if they rush Hexdrinker or more, and even the matchups you're good into. Champs like Olaf, they have a lot of room to play it out because your 1 to 5 is so weak. So I'm going to be putting her in D tier as a bad blind pick. Now, as for Akshan, he's a pretty good blind, but the Jax matchup is still unplayable. It's a lot better now after the Jax nerf, but I would never go into a game wanting to play Akshan into Jax. So I'm going to be putting him into B tier. Ban Jax before you pick the champion if you are wanting to blind him. And you can get prior in a lot of your matchups and, abuse them 1 to 3. So it can be quite a good blind, even if he's not the most useful champ in the world. He doesn't really provide any CC or tankiness or anything like that. But in terms of your laning power, he is quite strong. Just playing him into Jax is extremely difficult, so I would recommend banning it. Moving on to Aurora. Now, this champion's pretty interesting. I feel like Riot is really struggling to balance her. Feels like she's getting buffed or nerfed every single patch, but I'm going to be putting her into S tier. I think this champion's very powerful right now and a really good blind pick. When I watch players like Keen blind pick her, even if they get counterpicked by really good players like Zeus, they just completely dominate the matchup. This champion is so good as a blind pick. You do need to have good mastery on her. She's quite hard to execute because you're still a squishy range champion, even though you have quite a lot of mobility. But in terms of the 1v1, your blind pick, the counters you run into, this champion does very well into most of them, and even the hard ones, champs like Irelia, you have a lot of room to outplay if you have good mastery on the champ. Now, as for our girl Camille, we did have that nice run after her buff where she was probably one of the best champions in the entire game, and she's still very strong, but as a blind pick, I'm going to be putting her into A tier, so pretty solid, but there are some tough matchups, champs like Jax, Fiora, Renekton, Poppy, the 4 classic counters, they are still quite annoying, and if you play better than them, of course there is room to win those matchups, but even skill versus even skill, it's not really in your favor, so I'd say because she has a lot of counters, and her counters are very popular champions, you're going to be finding yourself in A tier. Moving on to Cassiopeia, who's also going to be finding herself in A tier. I feel like this is a champion where if you see blind picked in solo queue, it's very hard to pick a counter that feels really good for you. Now, there are some champs where if you survive to a certain point, champs like Mordekaiser, if you can get to 6, you can't run her down. Or champs with great gank setup like Camille, if you get to 6 as well and your jungler's playing topside, really hard for Cassio to play. But in terms of pure 1v1, unless you're a master of a champion like Irelia, who has so much kill threat onto her, it's going to be very hard for you to play against her if she has really good spacing and skill shot accuracy. And as for Cho'gath, I'm going to be putting him into D tier. He's a pretty bad blind. He's very close to being terrible, but because this is a general tier list, you can get away with his bad matchup in lower ranks. You can sit 2 screens away and just farm with Q or poke them. So you can play against players with, not the best wave control and not the best trading. If you play this champion and get to level 5 to 7 unscathed, you're going to be okay. But if you verse a good player and he's playing champs like Olaf, Darius, even a champ like Silas with a lot of kill threat onto you, it's going to be pretty much impossible to play. So I'm going to be putting him to D tier, but the higher you go, the worse he's going to be. Moving on to Corki, and he's actually surprisingly a pretty good blind pick. I'm going to be putting him into A tier. Even matchups that you might assume would be unplayable, champs like Jax, give a lot of room to outplay, especially after all of Jax's nerfs. Ryder's really beating that guy down. So there's not a lot of matchups that are unplayable. Yeah, if you did versus a great Irelia, you would struggle, but those are very, very rare. Very unlikely you run into one. So the champions that are more common, you're going to do quite well into. So champs like Set, champs like Nasus that are picked a lot, very easy to dominate them. And even champs like Jax, Camille, Fiora, it is favored for you. I'd say Camille a little bit less so because her gank setup is so high, but because you can maintain prio the whole time, and you can just wave clear from quite far away, W away from ganks, as long as you're maintaining prio, poking her down and getting good vision, you should be able to play out even those hard, high gank threat matchups. Now, as for Darius, I'm still going to be putting him into A tier, even though this is one of the least favorable metas for this champion, with all the AP junglers and ADCs running around. Can be quite annoying. His laning power is so high, I'm still going to be putting him into A tier because there's not really any counter picks that feel unplayable. Even the hard ones like Vayne, with Fleet being nerfed a million times and Lethal Tempo removed, are a lot better for you. And the strong melee matchups like Jax with Lethal Tempo, that's gone as well. And even Set with Ignite, do have some room to outplay it. There's not really any matchup where if you blind Darius and they pick it, it feels completely unplayable. He's still a strong blind, and even against these annoying range counter picks, if you can get onto them, it's completely over. And worst case scenario, once you spike it, Stride Breaker, very hard for them to play the game. Moving on to Dr. Mundo, and I'm going to be putting him into B tier. I'd say very low B, high C, depending on your bracket. And my reasoning for that, I played a lot of Mundo very recently. Like the guide, I blind picked him every single game no matter what, and the only matchup that was unplayable was that Gwen, where Gwen is so hard because she wins the lane the whole time, outscales you inside, and she's one of the best scaling tops in the entire game. So you're giving her a not just a free lane, but a winning lane, and she wins side as well. Where every other counter pick champ like Aatrox champs like Darius, you do have some room to play it or even outplay them, and especially once you get Warmogs and Ruby, if you're not behind, you can still be very impactful in those games. So even though the lane might be hard, not really picking Mundo to win lane 1 to 5 anyway, and if you get to level 6, 7 unscathed, get a bit of HP under your belt, those matchups, the Darius and the Aatrox, they're still hard, but nowhere unplayable. Now, as for Fiora, a lot of you might enjoy this, but she's finally going to be demoted from S tier into A tier. She's still a great blind, don't get me wrong, and I will rearrange all these champions at the very end from left to right, and she will be one of the highest in A tier. Her laning is very good, but she's just completely terrible in this meta. If you pick Fiora, and they have champs like Irelia and an AD carry mid, you're not going to be very useful, and even though your laning power is quite high, there are some very difficult matchups. Champs like Kennen are very hard to play, or even if you verse a good Corki player, very rare I know, unless you're playing in high ranks. There are a lot of hard range matchups. Aurora as well can be difficult, so this champion can struggle if range counter pick stop, but also into heavy range comps in general. As for Gangplank, we're going to be putting him into D tier, still a pretty bad blind pick. There are a lot of hard range matchups you're going to run into, or champions like Rumble, pretty much unplayable, and even if you do get away with those matchups and do quite well, it takes you so long to come online and be useful compared to in the past, and Quick Blade's not really being good for Gangplank anymore, makes this champion not even worth the payout if you do win those bad matchups. Moving on to Garen. Now, Garen is pretty hard for me to place right now, but I'm going to be putting him into C tier. I think he is a decent blind, but if you are to play him in higher ranks, you're really going to struggle. There's too many hard matchups. Champs like Kennen, a great Kennen player is going to make your life miserable, or even strong melees like Darius can run you down. It's really hard for you to find a lot of value as a blind pick on this champ until Stride Breaker, and by then a lot of games are already decided. But if you do pick him in lower elo brackets, so I'd say even Emerald 4 and below, this champion is amazing. Such a good blind pick and really good to learn the game on as well. So don't get scared just because I put him lower on the tier list than I normally did. Just because in this meta, and in higher ranks when you verse good laning players, the counter picks are very hard to play against. So for that reason, I'm going to be putting him into C tier. Now, as for Gnar, I'm going to give him a bit of a promotion. I'm going to be putting him straight into B tier. If this was a high elo tier list, I'd put him in A tier. I think he's in a pretty good spot right now as a blind. But because if you were to play in the mid-range brackets around Emerald to Diamond and you verse Irelias, you're going to struggle, or Jayces or Camilles, you do have room to outplay those matchups, but the onus is on them, right? They have more agency than you, and even champs like Kennen can be quite difficult. So he does have quite a few matchups that are not great for you. But there's not really any matchup that's completely unplayable, except for Irelia if the Irelia is competent. So for that reason, I'm going to be putting him into B tier. But in lower elo brackets, I'd be dumping him down, and in higher ones, I'd be bumping him up. Now, as for Gragas, I'm going to be putting him straight into S tier. In terms of his champion power, I don't think he's in the best spot right now compared to how OP he was in previous seasons, but as a blind pick, he is one of the best. He's so versatile. You can take Comet into scary range matchups, Phase Rush into champs that run you down, like Olaf, or even Grasp into melee matchups that you can brawl a lot. Other tanks, or champs like Ornn, you can take Grasp and beat them down, maybe even demolish in front of them. So he's got a lot of versatility in terms of whatever matchup you're up against, there is a build that can work for you, and there's not really any counter matchup that you play against. It's unplayable. Worst case, you can sit back and farm with Q and poke them down. There's not really anything that they can pick into that guarantees them an advantage. Now, as for Gwen, I'm going to be putting her straight into D tier. She's just straight up a bad blind pick. If you read our criteria, she sucks in this meta. Strong AP junglers running around like Irelia and AD carries. Very hard for you to get a lot of value from your champion. Gwen wants more melee champs the better. She wants meatballs that run into her. So that meta previously where there's junglers like Zinzel and Vi going forward, it was very powerful. But now it's going to be pretty rare that you get that as a blind. And in terms of your laning as well, also very difficult. Previous players playing champs like Jayce or Fiora that play the matchup quite well, or even any range matchup like a Kennen or champs like Rumble. So hard to play out your lane, especially if you verse one of those counter matchups and the rest of their team comp is quite heavily ranged. Your champ's going to be almost useless unless you get really far ahead somehow. As for Illaoi, I'm going to be putting into C tier. She's still a decent blind, but very low on C tier. Terrible in this meta when there's a lot of range champions, not really any meatballs running towards you. And in terms of your matchups, you will really struggle into strong early melees. Champs like Fiora and Darius can try to kill you pre-6, or even some scary range top players playing champs like Kennen. Very hard for you to get value on this champ. As for Irelia, she's going to be finding herself into A tier, still a pretty good blind pick. I would say lower on A tier than she normally is. There are some scary matchups that you run into. A good Fiora players or Darius do have that advantage. But if you're really high mastery on this champion, even those matchups aren't too bad, and because it's a heavy range meta, it's actually pretty favorable for her overall. Next up, we have Jax, and Jax I also have to demote. He's going to be finding himself in A tier, and like we touched on a little bit before, Riot just really hates this dude at the moment. He's just getting nerf after nerf, lethal tempo removed, E-nerf multiple times. Just not a good day to be a Jax main, but he's still Jax. You're still a great champion with a lot of carry threat. You have high mastery on the champion, even the hard matchups like Kennen or Gragas do have room to outplay. So I'd say he's still a good blind pick, but as he gets weaker and weaker as a champion, and the way they're nerfing him, it affects his laning more so than his mid to late game, so his value has dropped as a blind pick. Moving on to Jayce, who's going to be finding himself in B tier. He's a great blind pick, but he still has the same issue that he has every season, where if you play up against a Malphite and the enemy jungler wants to gank you, it's very, very hard for you to play the game. Even if you verse an autofill Malphite and you play extremely well, if the enemy jungler wants to take you out, they can. Malphite can ulti once, burn your flash, and then you have this kind of 3-minute timer when the Malphite ultis back up. That's so hard for you to play and pressure and survive in that game unscathed, and they can even dive you if the enemy jungler is strong enough. So very hard for you to play this matchup, but I would say in terms of 1v1 custom game, that matchup is actually Jayce favored at the highest level, but because unfortunately there are junglers in the game, I'm going to be putting him into B tier, and I do recommend banning that Malphite away. As for Kayle, she's going to be our first champion that jumps straight into the terrible blind pick category. She's lost lethal tempo, fleet's been nerfed a bunch, and there's just way too many hard matchups for her to play. And especially with this meta, if you have a strong AP jungler like a Talia or a Irelia, and you're playing Kayle, your team comp's going to be completely terrible. And these matchups, even though they have been nerfed, champs like Jax really hard to play, Camille has too much gank threat, there's just way too much threat against your champion to get to that spike unscathed, especially now that Berserker Greaves are nerfed as well. There were a lot of matchups where if you get to level 6 and you're even or ahead, with Berserks, you can run them over, and even that spike is a little bit weaker. So pretty bad meta, pretty bad year for Kayle overall, so she's going to stay in the terrible category. Next up, we have Kennen. I'm going to be putting Kennen straight into S tier at the very beginning. This is the strongest blind pick on the entire patch in my opinion. There's no matchup that you'll run into if you blind pick Kennen that feels unplayable. Even the harder ones like Irelia, you have room to outplay it. And if you see Kennen blind picked on the enemy team, not really a counter pick you can pick that feels really good. If you play Olaf, which was a counter in the past, he can take phase rush and just poke you out. Even champs like Camille, where you have a lot of ganks set up, you do have to rely on your jungler in some way. And if your jungler doesn't come, as usual, then you're really going to struggle in that 1v1. So this champion's such a good blind, does well in the meta as well, where there's a lot of scary range champions running around. But if you can get onto them, get a great flank with your flash, you can completely turn the tides of that team fight. So this champion is really good in lane, really good outer lane, not really a hard counter to him that you're going to struggle in if you have high mastery on this champion. Now, as for Kled, I'm going to be putting him straight into D tier. The one saving grace of this champion is he's pretty unpopular, so not a lot of people know how to play against him, and they don't really know how the dismount interaction works, the remount, so they do struggle, and you can get some surprise kills because of that fact. But if you have players that have been around for a few years, they know what they're doing, and they counter you with a strong range champ like Kennen or even Jayce or Gnar, it can be quite difficult, and even some strong melees like Jax, Fiora, really hard for you to play into, so you're pretty much bound to verse a player that knows a counterpick to your champion most of the time, so it is going to be very hard to blind pick this champ. Now, as for Cassante, I'm going to be putting him straight into C tier because he's so hard to place. If you were to play him in a high challenger lobby and you have extremely high mastery on the champ, he's going to be A tier for sure. Great blind pick champion. There's not really too many matchups that are unplayable. That's why you see him in pro play even after 200 nerfs to the champ. But the exact same thing is going to be on the reverse. If you play him a low elo game like silver or bronze, you're going to really struggle even into common champs like Mordekaiser or Garen that run around in those brackets very frequently. Those matchups can be hard if you don't have really high mastery on this champ, so I'm going to have to equalize him and put him into D tier. As for Malphite, I'm going to be putting him straight into D tier. Pretty bad blind pick right now. Probably one of the worst if you don't ban Sylas as well, but even if you do ban Sylas to blind pick this champion, he's still not going to do well. Even in the lower elo brackets, there are a lot of players that play champs like Dr. Mundo and champs like Mordekaiser who have great lanes and Malphite, and they also outscale you as well. Mundo can even blow up your tower in front of you if he plays it quite well, and especially in high elo brackets, if you verse great players playing champs like Rumble, you're really going to struggle, borderline unplayable matchup. Next up, we have Mordekaiser, and Mord I'm going to be putting into A tier. I'm close to putting him into B tier and recommending that you ban Darius. There is a lot of room to outplay that matchup, especially if you take Ignite, so I'm going to be putting him into A tier. There's no matchup that's unplayable. There are some hard ones, don't get me wrong, like Darius and Olaf, but you do have room to outplay them, even into annoying range matchups like Kennen, champs like Jayce. Once you get level 6, you do have a lot of kill threat onto them. I'll say this champion is a pretty solid blind pick in general. Pretty low A tier, I would say, but an A tier nonetheless. Next up, we have Nasus, and Nasus is actually a pretty decent blind pick right now because you do have that option to go that AP build and make your lane very oppressive. You do scale a bit worse with that build, but if you play up against champs like Kennen or Jayce, who can be annoying range counters, if you have that AP build, your poke is so high, it's hard for them to really punish you. And even if you go the normal build with Triforce, you have a lot of kill threat onto champs at level 6. As long as you can lane very well, 1 to 5, you are going to do well. But because of that fact, where your 1 to 5 is so weak, if you verse champs like Darius, they can run you down with a lot of kill threat, and they have good wave control, it's really hard for you to get to that spike without getting behind. Now, as for Olaf, I'm going to be putting him into A tier. He's not as strong of a champion as he was in previous metas, but still a good blind pick. There are a lot of matchups you can outplay, even if they are technically counters. Even matchups like Fiora, it becomes pretty unplayable at Ravenous Hydra, but before that you do have a lot of room to kill her, and if you can get that lead against her, even when she gets Hydra, you do have room to run her down. So not a bad matchup as long as you can avoid that parry, utilize your Ghost well. I'd say that one is definitely playable, so I wouldn't put him in B tier for that reason. And even the annoying range matchups like Kennen, if they don't take Phase Rush, if they fail that kind of champ select skill test, then you can kill them as well. And even if they don't, if you can get to Stride Breaker, you do have a lot of kill threat on them regardless. Now, as for Ornn, he's still going to find himself in A tier. This champion's always going to be a very good blind pick. There's no real unplayable matchups. You have good poke into range runs. You have a lot of high burst into melees. And if they try to run you down, you have a lot of escape and disengage. So really good blind pick overall. Even if you go down a bit of CS, you're always going to be useful in the game. Now, as for Pantheon, he's also going to be an A tier, of course, higher than Ornn. I will rearrange it at the very end. This champion is so powerful in lane. There's not very many matchups that are unplayable. The best picks into Pantheon are more so those neutralizers like Gragas, and even that is a favorable matchup for you. But if those champs like Gragas and Malphite go even, they can outscale you later on. Even champs like Mundo, if you don't get a lead early, can be quite tough. You do need to play very, very well, levels 1 to 5, but if you can do that and you get a lead before these champions get their combat ultimate, your champ's going to be very oppressive to play against in those lanes. Moving on to Poppy, and I'm going to be putting Poppy into A tier. This champion is very strong in lane, and there are some hard matchups like Darius or Olaf, but you have a lot of poke, you have a lot of harass in those lanes, and if you're very, very good at spacing on this champion, they're not going to be unplayable whatsoever, and of course annoying range champions like Kennen can be tough as well, but again, you have so much poke, they don't have sustain, you definitely have room to outplay pretty much every one of your counter picks, so for that reason she's going to be in A tier. Next up, we have Quinn, and I have just a handful of really good Quinn mains on the Korean server, and I'm going to be putting her into B tier. They all ban Malphite for a reason. It's too easy for Malphite to win that lane, and even if he doesn't win 1v1, it's very, very easy gank setup, so hard for Quinn to get a lot of value in that matchup. Now, as for Renekton, I'm going to be putting him straight into A tier. This champion's a very good blind pick. There are some tricky range matchups you'll run into, but if you can utilize bush control very well, stay high HP early game 1 to 3, and get level 3, level 4 with good Fury, you have a lot of room to outplay them or kill threat or even gank setup. So these matchups are in the favor of the range champion, of course, but they have to play it extremely well, and if you punish their misposition, you can gain yourself a lead in those lanes. Now, as for Rengar, he's also going to be an A tier. He's a pretty good blind pick. He's also got that surprise factor where not a lot of people know how to play against the champion. So if you're really good at this champ, you can get a lot of solo kills against players that don't really know his damage or his jump from bush range. So that is a big part of it. But he is just a good blind pick in general. There are some tricky matchups, but champs like Jax, who are good into Rengar, have been nerfed quite a lot. So he's in a pretty comfortable spot right now as a blind pick. Moving on to Riven, and Riven I'm going to demote, I'm going to be putting him into B tier. I still think this champion is a very good solo queue champion, but in terms of a blind pick, she has a lot of really hard matchups. Renekton is pretty much unplayable, so I'll put her in B tier to ban it. You can play that matchup if you really want to, but I do recommend the ban because he has all that ease of execution, and if you don't get a kill early game, you're probably not going to be able to do so. So I'd ban Renekton into Riven pick is my recommendation. I see a lot of the good Rivens also do that. But even if you do ban Renekton, champs like Kennen are very, very hard to play. Champs like Poppy are tricky as well. So I'll be putting her into B tier. But if you have really high mastery on the champion, there's no reason why you can't do well in those lanes. Now, as for Rumble, I'm going to be putting him straight into S tier. He did receive a nerf, but that kind of just made him go from disgustingly OP to regular OP. He's still a strong champion. You see his pick rate hasn't really changed in competitive because everyone realizes he's still very powerful, and that hasn't changed as a blind pick as well. He's still such a strong blind pick, wins the majority of his lanes. His kill threat is a little bit lower with that Q nerf, but he's still going to be favorable in pretty much every matchup you play against. Now, as for Sejuani, I'm not going to spend too much time on her as she's not really popular, but I'm going to be putting her into the terrible tier. She's just not a very good blind pick. Struggle into strong Juggernaut style champs like Olaf and Darius, and also range matchups are very tricky as well. She doesn't really have a good place in the meta. Now, as for Set, I'm going to be putting him into C tier. He is pretty decent. I think he's not great in this meta with a lot of range champs running around. And also, there are some tricky range matchups you'll run into. But I will say he does very well into a lot of melees. You have so much kill threat with Ignite. You can demolish tower in front of a lot of matchups if you gain a lead. So I'm going to be putting him into C tier because if you have high mastery on the champ, you can grow really big advantages even in the tricky, skilly, or hard matchups. Next up we have Shen, and unless your name is Shending Help, I don't recommend blind picking this champion. I'm going to be putting him straight into D tier. He has so many hard matchups, unplayable versus strong range matchups, and even the strong melee bruisers like Mordekaiser and Aatrox really, really hard, and those champions are very popular, so you're almost guaranteed to play a matchup that's very, very difficult for you. Now, as for Shyvana, straight to terrible, don't need to elaborate. This champion just straight sucks. There's no matchup that I can out here where I'd want to beat Shyvana, so I'll keep her in there. And as for Sin, she's going to be a bad one. Not as bad as Shyvana, of course, but just not a great blind pick. Same reasoning that I'll give for a lot of these champions that are bad. They struggle into so many different categories of champion that it's really hard to get value. The reason Singe is not terrible compared to bad is just because he can proxy. So if you're in a really hard matchup, you can even just give up 6 minions and start to proxy, because if you can't get pushed, you can't really get behind them. But if your opponent takes a bad base and you get in that proxy position, really hard to stop you. And even if you can't get yourself a recall, you can give those 6 minions and start to proxy. So you can avoid some of these really unplayable range matchups if you do that. But that still means he's a bad blind. You have to give up an entire wave just to be fine in certain matchups. So I'm going to say he's going to sit in D tier. Next up, we have Sion, and Sion is in a pretty bad spot right now, and as a blind pick, I'm going to be putting him into D tier. A lot of strong melee champions that have a lot of kill threat onto you, and especially next patch, when they nerf death timers, champion's going to be even worse. But as a blind pick, I'd say he's not the worst. I wouldn't put him into awful, because into range matchups, if you have very good E accuracy, hit your E into Q onto Jayce, champs like Jayce and Kennen, you can poke them a bit, and give yourself some breathing room, but his 1 to 3 is so weak, a lot of these strong melees can force kills onto you, and they can snowball off you very easily. Next up, we have Skarner, and Skarner went from one of the best tops in the entire game to pretty much an unplayable champ, and as a blind pick, I'm going to be putting him into D. He loses into many categories of champions, so everyone in S tier and a lot of these strong A tier bruisers will just run you down and kill you. Your early game is just way too weak for the champion to be any higher than D tier, and he's just in a pretty bad spot overall. Now, as for Tahm Kench, I'm going to reluctantly put him into C tier. I do want to put him lower, but his laning power is very high. Not good in this meta whatsoever. Too many range champions and a lot of burn, like Lilia and Bran, make your champion unplayable. But in terms of your laning power, he is pretty solid. You can poke down range champions, and if you get your Q into W combo into these range champs like Jayce or Kennen, you can get some value. But a lot of these melee champs will run you down, like Darius or Olaf, and you do get outscaled by pretty much everything. So he's just not the best champ overall. That's not really the criteria though. In terms of his laning, he is just a decent blind pick. Moving on to Teemo, and Teemo I'll put into A tier. I think he is a pretty good blind pick. There are some tricky matchups, especially champs with a lot of gank setup, and champs that are range and also a bit stronger than you, like Kennen, and champs like Rumble, very, very tricky. But he has a lot of harass. He's very hard to play against as melees, and if you have very good spacing and positioning on this champ, you can be very oppressive to play against. Next up, we have Trundle, and it has been a few months, but Trundle still hasn't recovered from Lethal Tempo being removed, so he's going to go straight into Terrible tier. I think he's just such a bad blind. He sucks in this meta really badly. Probably one of the worst champs I could think of to play in this meta, apart from Shyvana. And he's also very hard in lane to play against pretty much any ranged champion you can think of. And with Lethal Tempo being removed, he's lost a lot of that kill threat that he had against melee champions as well. And as for Tryndamere, I'm actually going to put him into S tier. I think this champion has changed his identity quite a bit. Now he's more of a grasp or fleet with Ravenous Hydra type champ. He just has infinite sustain. He has no mana. He can sustain from full HP once he has Ravenous Hydra in a single wave. But even before that, he's very annoying to play against because his sustain is so high. So it's very hard to guarantee an advantage against him, other than a little bit of a CS lead if you can zone him from the wave. But his sustain, is so high, and with his ulti and his summoner spells, very hard to gain kills and big advantages against his champion. So I'd say as a blind pick, he can win a lot of matchups as well. Of course, you have a lot of kill threat later on, but also in terms of getting punished by your counters, very hard for them to do so. As for Twisted Fate, he is barely a top laner anymore, but I'll still put him on the list, just in case there's still some TF players out there. But as a blind pick, he's not the best. I'll put him in B tier, because if you ban Jax, you can do pretty well into a lot of these melee champs that you'll run into, especially the popular ones, if you have very good spacing. But I don't recommend blind picking him without banning Jax, because that matchup is still very difficult. Now, as for Udyr, I'm close to putting him into A tier, but I will put him into B tier. There is ways to play it, but I believe the Darius matchup is very, very difficult to play. The best way to play Udyr right now, from what I've seen, is the AP tank or full tank variant, and if you try to play that into Darius, it's very hard, and the matchup is very difficult as well. But if you ban Darius, he's a pretty good blind. He's close to being A tier, I would say. If you ban him, you're going to have a lot of success. There are some tricky lanes you'll run into, like Aatrox or Olaf, but if you get very good at those matchups and utilizing your Awaken well, there is room for you to outplay them. Next on our list, we have Urgot, and Urgot I'll put into C tier, pretty low on C tier, I might add, especially with the recent double nerf to Fleet. He's just not in the best spot right now, but in terms of his blind pick power, he can do pretty well into a lot of melees, especially if you abuse level 1, and he does have a lot of kill windows that people aren't familiar with, so he can be good, but I'm not going to put him any higher because some ranged matchups are very tricky, and a lot of melees like Darius, Fiora, and Mordekaiser, and even champs like Olaf have a lot of kill threat onto you, and can be very difficult unless you just have much higher mastery on your champion than they do. Now, as for Vayne, I will be putting into C tier, high C, where she is a pretty good blind pick in high elo brackets, but because you need to have very, very good spacing on this champion, even in matchups that are not too bad for you, I'm going to be putting her lower because it's very rare to run into a player below Diamond that has really high spacing to the point where they can blind pick Vayne into any of these matchups and be happy. Moving on to Vladimir, and Vlad I'll put into B tier. It is very, very unlikely, but I would recommend banning Irelia, because if you verse somebody with a lot of mastery on the champ, this matchup can be extremely hard to play. Not unplayable, but so hard to the point where I would recommend banning it, because all the other melee counter picks aren't as bad. So if you ban that champion, you can have value, and he actually does pretty well into some of these annoying range matchups, apart from Rumble can be quite tricky, but even Rumble got nerfed, so I'd say he's in a not a better spot as he was on previous patches. Now, as for Volley, I'll be putting Volley into D tier. There are a lot of hard range matchups you'll run into, and even some melee matchups can be tricky, but in this meta, he is just completely terrible. If you verse a strong range AP jungler and an 80 carry mid, you're not going to have any value in the game whatsoever, or even if it's not an 80 carry mid, good luck playing into champs like Hui mid and a Lilia jungle. You're going to be completely useless unless you get a big lead in your lane, but because you're blind picking and you're probably going to get countered, that's going to be extremely unlikely. Now, as for Warwick, I'll be putting Warwick into C tier. I think he's a pretty decent blind. He also has that surprise factor when a lot of people know his limitations, especially around his healing. But I'd say this champion will struggle into this meta as well, so I wouldn't put him any higher than C tier. And as a blind in lane, he is still going to have some tricky melee matchups and some range runs as well. Next up, we have Wukong, and Wukong I just have to put as a terrible blind pick. I think he has some room as a counter, especially into AD range champions, but as a blind pick, if you verse champs like Rumble or Mord, or even easy to execute champs like Malphite, very, very hard to be useful on your champion, because this is a champ that definitely needs to snowball, and if you're blind picking, that's going to be very difficult. Now, as for Yasuo, I'm also going to put him in terrible tier. Very bad blind pick. You just can't verse pretty much any champion on this list. Of course, not all of them, but if you play against a good Jax, Fiora, Darius, as I go on, Renekton, you're not going to have any value in that game. You're going to be a liability. Now, as for Yone, I actually think this champion's in a pretty good spot. I'm torn between putting him in B or A tier. I would say banning Jax would be nice quality of life, and especially in lower than challenger elo brackets, because that matchup is quite Jax favored. But you do have a lot of room to outplay it, especially if you have insane levels of mastery on the champion and you're playing on low ping and can space him well. So I'd put him in A tier and higher brackets, but I'll keep him in B tier for this tier list. Now, as for Yorick, I'm going to be putting him into low C tier. There are some matchups that are very, very tricky to play. A lot of range matchups are tough, and your 1 to 5 is so weak. A lot of champions have so much kill threat onto you if they have good wave control. Really hard for you to get level 6 unscathed. But even if you do blind pick and get to 6, if you verse certain champions like Mordekaiser, who can ult you and get rid of your maiden, you're still going to struggle. So I'd say he's not the best blind pick, but you have really high mastery on this champion, can get to level 6 unscathed. There are a lot of champions you play into where you can do quite well. Moving on to Zac, and Zac I'll put in low C tier. I think he's a pretty decent blind pick. He also has that surprise factor where not a lot of people know how to play into the champ. He has so much healing. His early game is very, very weak to certain counters, and if you verse counters that beat you early and also outscale you, so champs like Darius and champs like Fiora, it can be quite annoying to play Zac into those. But this champion is very impactful. I think he's actually quite good in this meta. So if this was a tier list for how strong the champion is right now, I would actually probably put him in A tier. I think this champion's quite good, but as a blind pick, I'm going to be keeping him into D tier. Now, our final champ on the list, you might be surprised to see her, is going to be Zeri, and that's just because she's seen a lot of popularity by Zeus in competitive a couple weeks back, maybe a month back, and in solo queue I have seen her as a counter as well, mid and top. So I'm going to be putting her into B tier, one ban into pick. If you ban Jax and blind her, she is going to have some value in the game, but how useful she is, that is going to depend on the rest of the champs, of course. But as a blind pick and top, if you ban Jax, there's nothing that's really unplayable. Alright everyone, that's it for now, and as you can see on your screen at the moment, I've rearranged all the champions from left to right, strongest to weakest, so now they're in the correct order. But if you want to see me get more specific on these tier lists, and make one for low elo or maybe one for high elo, feel free to let me know in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time.